Good afternoon and welcome to Washington Week's digital show, Washington Week Recommends. I'm Yamiche Alcindor, and each week I recommend great reporting that I think deserves your attention. And today I want to highlight an incredible episode of Reveal's podcast called Locked Up, the prison labor that built business empires. It's based on reporting from the Associated Press about a form of slavery practiced by some southern states after the Civil War ended. It was called convict leasing, and for 60 years, states like Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, they sent African Americans in prison, usually for minor crimes in their state, to work for private companies for a price. And their work, doing things like building railroads, making steel, and working in coal mines, made those companies rich. Margie Mason is one of the Associated Press reporters behind this project, and she joins me now. So thank you so much for being here. Welcome to Washington Week Recommends. So Margie, if you could just break down the history of convict leasing and really the thesis of your reporting here.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Basically, we decided that we wanted to kind of do a deep dive and go back to the foundation of prison labor. And so when we started to dig into this, we really kind of went all the way back to, the end of slavery. And then we encountered this era of convict leasing. And as you said, many states in the South were, passing laws. They should have been misdemeanor crimes, but they were, people were being charged, these were felonies basically for very minor things like selling cotton after dark or not being able to produce, say, a piece of paper saying that you were employed, or, they used vagrancy and loitering, all these very minor things. And they started rounding up, it was mostly young African-American men. And then they were imprisoning them. And they were then leasing these men, there were some women as well, out to coal mines and railroads and iron ore mines. And they were giving them oftentimes very long sentences. And the treatment was just incredible. They were beaten. Oftentimes they weren't given warm clothing. They weren't given proper food. In some cases, there were years where up to 10% of them died in Tennessee. So this was a very brutal era in our history. And I think not a whole lot of people know a lot about it. And certainly, when you think about how this is really the foundation of prison labor, I don't think a lot of people connect the dots to that so much.
And as you talk about sort of this dark history, I wonder if you could talk a bit about how these companies made a profit and whether or not that financial gain, whether or not it benefited them, sort of was a foundation for some of the success that they have now.
Absolutely. The one place that we looked at in Tennessee was there was a stockade there. It was called the Lone Rock Stockade. And this was run by Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad, which at the time, this was late 1800s. This was one of the largest companies in the U.S. And of course, this was after the Civil War. The South was trying to desperately rebuild. And, they got rich. And then convict leasing eventually ended in Tennessee, and the company just kind of moved south to Alabama, to Birmingham. And then eventually U.S. Steel, we all know U.S. Steel, that was J.P. Morgan and Andrew Carnegie's company. It ended up taking over Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad and continued convict leasing for a number of years in Alabama as well.
Really important to think about sort of how we're seeing this in modern society still in some ways with these companies being financially wealthy. I wonder if you could talk a bit about how you start the podcast, because you started with a conversation that you're having with a Tennessee pastor whose ancestor was enslaved in part of this convict leasing situation. Tell me a little bit about why you wanted to start like that and what it was like to talk to the descendants of some of these people.
Well, we felt that it was really important if we were going to do such a deep dive into this history and ask people to come along with us for this podcast, we needed to have some really rich storytelling. And so we thought, how can we find a way to connect this, again, 150-year-old history to today? And so we basically kind of did the genealogy backward. You think about genealogy usually starting today and going back. We started it with a name in the past and came forward. And so we found a man, his name was Sheila Doss. He was imprisoned when he was 19 years old for a year of hard labor at the stockade in Tennessee, the coal mine. And he was convicted of stealing a hog worth $5. And we went through records in courthouses. I mean, we were digging through these leather-bound tomes with this like elegant 19th century cursive writing that was really hard to decipher. We were going through microfilm with the state archives. We were calling up funeral homes to see if anybody remembered any of these names from these little communities. And through kind of patching everything together, and a lot of work because the records were just so difficult for so many families. It just ended. We just lost the trail basically. But with this particular family, we found Reverend Jerry Whedon, who is a pastor in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And I called him up. It was a cold call. He didn't know anything. And I then proceeded to kind of go into all this history that I had found. And I had 50 pages of history on his family. And he just embraced it and said, come down, I want to know more. And I've really gotten to know him and his other family members well now. And it was a very difficult history, and it was hurtful, and it was hard to take in, but they've really embraced it.
And it's so powerful to think that you, in the podcast, you talk about people being separated from their families and wanting to, in some ways, put these families back together by teaching them or teaching them that history, sharing that history with them. Talk a bit about the goal there.
Yeah, I mean, I think with this particular family, they didn't even know about Sheila Doss. Sheila Doss had 10 daughters. And so the Doss name did not get passed on. They had all married and changed names. And so nobody had ever heard of Sheila Doss. And one of the really amazing things that happened as a result of this podcast, I mean, first of all, I got to meet this family, and they're incredible. But one of the things that happened was we met a 90-year-old man, this was after the podcast, who remembered Sheila Doss. And he was able to confirm, he was able to tell these family members a little bit about Sheila and his wife Fanny, but he was also able to confirm that they have a family graveyard there in Woodbury, which is just a beautiful spot. And we found Fanny's grave, but there was a marker next to hers, and all the writing was worn off. And so this elderly man was able to confirm that was Sheila's grave. And so the family's now going to go and put a new marker up, and they're leaving flowers. And, there's some other family members that we found through this that they didn't know about. So it's been, just a really interesting experience.
That's really, really incredible. Just to think about sort of that full circle moment. I want to, in some ways, dig back into the brutality that you report on in such great detail. You talk about, and you mentioned it in your first answer, 10% at times, 10% of inmates would die in these prisons that people were being held in. Why was that? Take us through that statistic and the brutality of all of this.
Well, I think that a large part of it was that at this point, they had this labor source, and they kept rounding up more guys. And so it was, there's been a book written, and there's a famous quote, one dies, get another. And so, they would have these quotas in the coal mines, say, where they needed to mine so many tons of coal a day. And if they weren't able to reach that quota, they were beaten. And it was a very thick leather, strap that was used. They just weren't given, again, proper nutrition. They were forced to be underground, oftentimes standing in cold water all day long, not having a change of clothes, having to come back to the stockade and, sleep in these dirty, cold clothes. And so disease was absolutely rampant. There was pneumonia and tuberculosis and typhoid fever that just ripped through. You can imagine these close, cramped quarters where people are not, being taken care of. And so between the disease and the guys would try to escape, and they would get shot. They would shoot them if they tried to escape. So it was just brutal. And these things were happening, and we found these the prison reports, inspector reports. So we know, these were things that were documented that we were able to kind of dig up and confirm that, it was a very, very brutal period.
Very terrible to think about. all of the things that people had to endure. You also, something that when I was listening to the podcast, I had to pause it and remind it and make sure I had heard that right. Arresting people between the ages of 12 and 16 was not abnormal. Could you explain that to me? Did I hear that wrong? Because it was such a crazy statistic to me that I thought maybe I had heard it wrong.
No, I mean, I think we found, children as young as 10. And I want to add that, this project was really started by this archaeologist. Her name is Camille Westmont. She was until recently at the University of the South, and she did an excavation of the site. But also she has put together this online database. And so she and others have been transcribing from these old, handwritten ledgers, these names of these, again, mostly men and children, and the details that were given to kind of have a place where people can go. If you're trying to do your genealogy and there's a hole, well, maybe it's because somebody got rounded up and sent to one of these stockades. And so they've done amazing work putting together this online database with, I think there's close to 5,000 names now on it.
Wow. And, we've been talking about, of course, who was impacted based on the podcast. This was a majority of them were Black men, though there were, of course, white people as well imprisoned. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about race and racism and how that impacted this. Of course, they were looking for labor, but there were particular people they were rounding up.
Yes. I mean, there were actually, it was a very corrupt, racist system. There were laws that, one of the things that we found on the books was miscegenation. And so that was basically, it was illegal to have any kind of interracial relations. And so we were finding people who were being rounded up for that. Most of the people, a large percentage, it was some form of stealing, basically. Some form of larceny. So in the case of Sheila Doss, it was a $5 hog. I found one case of a young boy. He was a teenager, I think, and he had stolen a pair of shoes, and he was sent to work in the coal mine. And it wasn't just the coal mine. They also had these coke ovens that were there that's used in the production of iron. And so they would take the coal and put it into the oven, and it was just like this inferno, and they would make the incarcerated men would have to go down there and rake, the coke out of the coke ovens. And it was just, it was so hot, and people got burned up or they died as a result of, working there. So it was incredibly dangerous. There were cave-ins, falling slate. It was, coal mining is we know this, it's a very dangerous profession even today. But back then, there were no protections, and they didn't care if they died, basically.
Wow. I also want to read to you an ACLU report from last summer found that 76% of incarcerated workers surveyed by the Bureau of Justice Statistics say they're required to work or face additional punishment. So I wonder, how is what you're seeing, what you studied when it came to this convict leasing, how is that connected to present day prison labor and what we're seeing now?
It's very connected. And one of the things that we mentioned in the podcast is the 13th Amendment. And the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution obviously abolishes slavery, but there's an exception. And the exception is unless you have been convicted of a crime. And so in a lot of the U.S. states, there's similar language in constitutions. And there's a movement now to kind of change this language and to abolish slavery for everyone, including people who have been convicted of a crime. And so just this past November, we saw 4 states, and one of those was Tennessee. They actually put it before the voters, and now that language has been removed, which opens up a whole new window. So if you are convicted and sentenced to hard labor and basically, told that you must work or you will be punished, now there's, potentially legal avenues that can be taken to kind of, fight against this if somebody does not want to work.
Yeah. I also want to ask you about reparations and sort of restitution. What is there any sort of conversation about how these companies, some of them that still exist, how they might pay this forward or pay back some of these people whose family members were tied up in this convict leasing? Any conversation about that?
Well, we were certainly in touch with U.S. Steel, and at first we didn't hear very much from them, but then we kind of kept reaching out to them. And they had, again, this mine in Alabama, and there's a cemetery there, which we were able to find. And we weren't able to confirm 100% that these were prisoners or former prisoners. However, most people, it's right on the site, and most people kind of assume that there are probably some of the the incarcerated men that work there. So the community members there have said that they want to talk to U.S. Steel. U.S. Steel has said, look, we're open to discussions, which I think is the first time that they have actually said this. So at this point, I think we're kind of waiting to see what happens. But just as a reference, Doug Blackman did a great book. It's called Slavery by Another Name. And so if anybody's interested in really looking in depth at this, it won the Pulitzer Prize, and it's really wonderfully done.
Well, that's great, and definitely a book that people should be maybe check out. I also just want to remind people it's the Reveal podcast called Locked Up, the prison labor that built Piz's empire. So thank you so much, Margie, for joining us and for sharing your reporting. And of course, thanks to all of you for watching Washington Week Recommends. You can find us here every Friday at 12:30 p.m. Eastern. And tonight, be sure to tune in to Washington Week on PBS. We'll discuss the death of Tyree Nichols as we all wait for that video of the body cam footage to be released. We'll see you this evening. Thank you again.
Thank you.